Good morning, Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We concluded paragraph on page 1361. So let me sum up what we learned. After explaining Malchus as an akuda, which means that it emanated originally just as a point, in contrast to Zah, which emanated as a six-faceted entity, in contrast to the Gimel Rishenis, Kasa Chachma Bina, which emanated with all the 10 spheres. But then there's another part to Malchus, which we call Binyan HaMalchus, what he called that B'Sei Teisvus, the 9 spheres that are added into Malchus as an additional piece, as additional components. He said that all when he began the discussion on page 1357. It's important to keep that in mind because that's the structure of what Malchus is about. So again, he was discussing there, remember, just to put it in context, we're talking about Zoh and Malchus, Mashpia and Makabel, like the sun and the moon. As we discussed earlier, that there's the Makabel, there are 3 levels in the Makabel, like the moon, the bright stone, and Hariyah, eyesight. And there's the Shemesh, which is the Mashpia. In spheres, this is Zoh and Malchus, as he began to explain on page 1355. And the difference between Zoh and Malchus is Mashpia and Makabel, the way God created existence, even before the diminishment of the moon, that Zoh is a Mashpia, it gives off light, and Malchus is a Makabel. So to explain that, he said that Malchus has nothing of its own. He gave the 2 interpretations in that. Either that Malchus receives what it has from Zoh, from the Mashpia, or it receives it from the Aveda of Neshamas below, which we're going to get back to later. So, and understanding that, he began from the Kisra Arizal Yodua that Malchus was Netzala, B'Seit Shedish, B'Bchinas Nekuda. And B'Seit Teisvus, so Shedish is its root, what it is intrinsically, its root core, what he called Nekuda Hashroshis. And then there's what's added on, like in any type of situation where you have something that's the core element, and then you add other ingredients into it. So after explaining the Nekuda, which is a state of concealment, that's why it's only a point, which is rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, in the Helama Atzmi, and the higher levels that are higher than Gilui, which he called Merchava Atzmi, a place of total expansiveness, but that's even beyond expansiveness in the world of Giluyim. So he then said that Malchus is a Nekuda, which is in a state of concealment, in a state that only has, the that Malchus has is only for itself, for its own needs. Like the student that is only busy absorbing, it's completely in a state of absorption. That is what we learned on page 1359. Then, on 1360, the Rebbe Rashab continues, and what we learn now, the last paragraph, is then there's the other side of Malchus. That we said, Shcherani, that's the dark side. I am dark and concealed, but Vanova, and beautiful. What's the beautiful part? So the Ramah says, because Malchus has the capacity to elevate and stand face to face, panim b'panim with Zoh. So this is already Malchus as it's being filled in and growing, not Malchus in its Nekuda. As a Nekuda, it's purely Makabel, purely in a state of absorbing. And aliyah v'skalus, as he put it. It's elevating and being encompassed in its source. Zoh also has an element of absorbing, but Zoh also is a mashpia. So even when it elevates, he explained, the elevation is in order to receive from its source, but not being encompassed in the source. Whereas Malchus is encompassed. But then there's the other side of Malchus, where it has the capacity to stand face to face with Zoh. So first, the Rebbe Rashab began by quoting the Pri Eitz Chaim and the Sharko and the Arizal again, that this is the process that they explain that Malchus at night, at midnight, descends into Biyah. In the morning, it elevates to the Chazay, to the chest of Zoh, and receives a trace of the intellect And he said that's tefillin shel rosh, tefillin shel yad, and tefillin shel rosh. And he explained tefillin shel yad is more the moichin of nukva, a moichin that's more about details. I'm sorry, a moichin that's more general, and moichin of zah, tefillin shel rosh, is a moichin intellect that's more the details, understanding God in detail. Or another way he explained it is the difference between understanding the divine within existence, mamala kalman, das tachten, or understanding the divine that's beyond existence, transcendence, das elyon. Then he said, Omnam, binyan Malchus, for Malchus to be a mashpia and biyah, because the ultimate goal is that Malchus draw all the energy of Atzilus. So even though it began as an akudah to be absorber, but the goal is ultimately that Malchus should be a mashpia, to transmit all the energy that it receives in Atzilus from Zah into biyah. Like he says, and on the contrary, Malchus is the primary creative force because Zohar itself is too intense to go into Biyah. It's too high of a level. That's why Ikar HaSavaselim, the creation of existence and its sustenance, has to come not from the 10 spheres, but which are too much, or which are still a revelation, a Gilei Helam of the Maitzil, of the emanator, but to Malchus, because Malchus is a concealer, which is most likely also connected to the fact that Malchus is a Nakuda. Because it's only a Nakuda, it conceals, as we learned earlier, that Makabel is a concealer as opposed to Mashpia. And that's why Malchus is the source of creation. But on the other hand, in order for it to create, it has to have substance. So where does it get that substance? That's called Binyan HaMalchus. So the Binyan HaMalchus is the 10 spheres that fill up Malchus, and that's where the 9 spheres come into play. So Malchus is really a combination of, number one, a complete diminishment. That it's only a melech, like you said, Shmoi melech nikra aleim. When you say someone's a king, he's your authority, but you don't know anything about him. But yet, for him to be a king, he needs to have his faculties complete. And these faculties consist of Keser, Moichin, and Midas. And that's the rest of the explanation of the section, which we learned yesterday. Let me sum that up. So Keser is Ratzon. You need the king, not just to be himself, his nasus atzmus, like he explains it afterwards, that he's fundamentally a kingly state that's exalted and beyond everything. You need him to want to be the king over these people. That's in a king below. In kingship above, in Malchus of Biyah, you needed to have Keser to draw the Shabia Rotzen that connects the Malchus to Keser. That connects Malchus to become Keser of Biyah, to be an actual king over Bri Yitzir Asiyah. So the first thing you need, like he says, is Chinus HaRotzen. I'm reading on the bottom of page 1360. But that's Rotz. But that's not enough. You also need him to govern the people and the nation and the empire. So even though Melucha itself is authority, it's Ratzon, that he rules with his desire, with his will, and with his command, with authority, but nevertheless, to run the kingdom, it has to be tam v'seichel. There has to be a system. So here you have both elements. And then he explains that these two elements is called the two levels of kiruv and richuk and kiruv in Malchus itself. The hashpah b'richuk is the fact that he's a king and he stands in a state of remus and isnasus, and the nation and the people and his subjects are in reverence. They revere him. Emes HaMelech. That is more of distance, but it's a relationship. However, the relationship is one, he's the king and you're the subject. It's very clear that there's nothing in common among them. The only thing in common that he's the king over them. So in the context of Malchus Lamaila, it's basically that the God is the king of the existence of the world, but he's king and we are the subjects. But then there also has to be Ashpa Bekiruv, that the king also engages and gets involved in the details. Like he said, Ashpa Bekiruv, HaMelech Ma'ayin Fakeach Be'inyone HaMedina. The Melech, the king, involves himself and the Mefarkeach, and he probes and analyzes what are the needs of his subjects, of the nation, of the people. To govern them with grace, or pleasantly with grace, and to fulfill all their needs, and to write laws that are for the benefit of the Medina. That's not just I'm an authority. The authority part is the necessity that you need to have, that there is an authority. But then you need to govern in details, and that comes down to so not just Keser, so Malchus needs, not just Keser, it also needs Chachma Midas for it to properly govern and create and sustain the worlds of Biyah. And that's what he says. First, there has to be a rotzen, that he wants to be king. Hashem melech geus lovash, that he manifests, he dresses himself in a garment of the robes of a king, kingly robes. These bechinas melucha. In other words, not enough isnasus be'etzem. The fact that he has a kingly personality, that he's above everything, isnasus be'etzem, that's l'mayla in Atzilus is not enough. Like he says, a human being, he gives an example, a human being also has a certain element of dignity, but that's in a state of hell and blias pashtus klal. And that's the nekuda of Malchus, he calls that. What we need here is liyas bebchinis isnasus ala elamis, that he shouldn't just be exalted, but he should be exalted over the worlds. So really, we're talking here is really three levels. The nekuda of Malchus is isnasus atzmi. That's how the king is on his own, and there he's in a complete state of bitl aliyah v'iskalus and absorbed by the source. Then there's how the king, keser, is nimshach within him. Not the keser of his rotzen to elevate and to be absorbed, but the keser, the rotzen to be king over biyah, that's keser. And then comes the chachma, the meichen and the midas, the chachma and the midas, to actual governance in the form of kiruv, where he relates to the people and governs them in all the matters that they are need. So you need isnasus elmelis, not just adeinei lam Hashem malach b'terem kol yitzur nivra. That's amelech meremem levade, amelech meremem levade. Uleis nasa b'cheftzei keil b'bchinas ha'chibz rotzen. You need it to come down. They should actually desire to govern over the biyah, over the worlds. Ozay melech shmei nikral am nifred misnasi mimei selam. And that's what you need, Amshachas HaRotzen from Keser Elyon. That's the Malchus, the Rotzen and Melucha. And that's why you need to build up Keser within Malchus. I'm reading the parentheses on page 1361 now. So even though we said Keser Malchus is Beseit Sherish in the root, but there, it's an Isnasus Atzmi. There it's an Aliyah V'Iskalus. There it's being absorbed and encompassed in its source. And now we need Keser to come down into Malchus. There should be this Galus HaMelucha, that the king should actually want the Keser to want to rule over Biyah and not just be in his root, the Nakuda, as he's encompassed in his source. Matter of fact, now I understand why he brought at the bottom of page 1359. Remember, he said Ratzon is Merutza, but there the Merutza, he said Oy Haritza, Oy B'chinas Amshacha, Oy B'chinas Halah. So there he was talking about Halah, that it's running, and it's a passionate drive to go upward in its source. And now he's talking about the Ratzon coming down, that he's committed to and wants to and desires to rule the people, the nation. So that's what happens in the binyan of this. That's still berichuk keser. The richuk b'chinas malchus. Reim v'sis nasus ala am. The hashpah b'kiruv is the binyan of Malchus that it now also receives from Chochma Midas. So now Malchus has all 10 spheres within it. Keser, Chabad, Chagas, and Nihi are all within Malchus. And those are the 10 things together with Malchus that create Asara Dvarim, that deals with every detail, Kol Ever Ve'ever, like you said, from who Bez Dinei, Bina, and Bez Din is Zon, good. And that's in the very creation of existence that God creates with these 10 elements through Malchus. And the same thing with the energy and vitality that sustains the worlds. Everything is traveling now through the 10 spheres of Malchus. So now, the fact that we, in Biyah, have the capacity to understand God and the feelings, to have divine feelings, to love God, all comes from the Moichin and Midas of Atzilus that travels through Malchus into Biyah. There you have it. That's a summary of what we learned yesterday. So there's a lot of details here. I think it's pretty clear. As far as Isnasus Satsmi, I said I would look into it. I did. I don't have much to add, to be honest. I think it's pretty clear that there are two states of Isnasus. The king on his own, even without never even becoming king, he just has that personality, so to speak. When we talk about human beings, a personality of the person is born. There's people that are born to be king. They may never end up being a king, but they have that element in them, that personality. Lamaila is the bare fact that God has the aspect of it being a king, meaning he's a kingly personality as well. Now, the truth is, the Eibush is not defined by that as well either. You can't even call God even a king be'etzem b'isnasus atzmis. But there is that level. That's called Malchus, as it is in Atzilus, the Nekuda of Malchus, or Malchus of Ein Sof, or even the highest levels, all the way in the deepest levels, maybe even in the Helam Ha'atzmi, that he's just removed from everything. God, by definition, is something that is unique. He's completely unique and exclusive in his own right. But you want to have God to be king and govern the world. Like we say in Rosh Hashanah, Melech, we want him to be our king. And for that, you need not just the Isnasus Atzmis, you need the Isnasus to come into a state of Isnasus ala Am. And that's what he's speaking about here, the Kesser, the Rotzen to actually be a king. And then comes the details of how he governs, running the world in all its details. And then you need all the spheres of Meichen and Midas. Now, the pages that were referred to, I think Yitzchak pointed out on page 1214, and as well as 1216 and 1217, does talk more about the different levels of Isnasus. So it's good to look there just to get a picture. But reading that, I don't know if it adds a lot to what we learned here. He does mention there that Malchus also encompasses 10 spheres, and the Kesser for Malchus, Kesser Malchus, like he says here. So it's consistent with what we learned there, but there's more details there if you want to really understand the process, how it moves from Isnasus Atzmis to Isnasus ala Am, from utter core exaltedness to an exaltedness over the nation, over the people. And there's more details there of the process of how that Rotzen develops and how it becomes more revealed until he actually becomes the actual king. Remember, even though he wants to be king over the people, it still doesn't mean he's king. You still need more levels till he actually becomes the Melech. So, but again, there's nothing there that I saw that really adds to understanding this. I think this is the picture, but it's very clear that the Nekudas HaMalchus is Isnasus Atzmis. That is clear. He says that clearly in the parentheses. Okay, so what do we have here? I'll just add one more point to make it a little more practical. The reason we need to know all this, because you could ask the question, what's wrong with just having a relationship with God, like you have a relationship with a spouse? You know, we also call God and the people chassid v'kala, bride and a groom and bride. Why do you need this isnasus? Because as I pointed out many times, in the interface between us and the divine, you need a good interface represents both sides well. If we only had a close relationship with Hashem, that would be beautiful. It's intimate. It relates to us. It's on our terms. But we wouldn't have a taste and we wouldn't be experiencing God on God's terms. Hisnasus, which is really another word for keser, remamus, like we spoke, remamus, is giving us a taste of the God that's beyond us. But it still relates to us because he's our God. So in other words, we're getting a sense of awe and reverence of something that is not us, beyond us. Now, the truth is there are levels even beyond that, where God isn't even in a state of isnasus. And that goes all the way up to levels that are beyond Giluyim altogether, and maybe even deeper. But at least in the context of this interface, so we have both sides to it. If we only had the connection to the Melech, that we stand and tremble before him and stand in awe, then it wouldn't be in our terms. If it was only in our terms, you wouldn't have the divine element. So that's why really Malchus is capturing both sides to it. Now, the fact that there's Isnasus Atzmis, even before Isnasus Ala'am, is also critical, because now we're getting also a taste and experience of God as he is on his own. Like B'terem Kol Yitzur Nivra. You could say our relationship with God is only as God relates with us. But then there'd be a ceiling and a limit to our interface, to our partnership. And as I've said many times, especially in Ayin Beis, Chassidus in general, the goal is to connect all the way to the highest levels. We even connect with Ein Oid, the root of it all in the Helam Ha'atzmi, and the very Kelim are rooted there. That's not the focus here, but the point is that we want to connect on all levels. And therefore, you have all these levels, not just the Shtalshelus, Chachma, and Midas, Moichen and Midas, but also Keser, not just Keser, but Moichen and Midas. And that's the Kiruv and the Dichuk. You have both sides to it. I was also wondering that since he mentioned Moichen before, the two levels of Tefillin Shel Rosh and Tefillin Shel Yad, is that also a form of like Stevav Kalam and Malach Kalalman? Das Tachnesan, is that similar to the two levels of Keser and Moichen? Because Keser is really not Moichen. But in Moichen itself, he also spoke about Moichen as it relates to existence or in general, and the details, or the transcendent element. Bottom line is you see there also the two aspects in the two tefillin, the tefillin shel yad, tefillin shel rosh, the tefillin shel yad, which is one box, one bias, and tefillin shel rosh, which is daled batim, that you also see an element of that. But point being, the main thing I want to emphasize is why we need all these aspects to it. But now it's all, the key is to remember it's all traveling through Malchus. And Malchus fundamentally is Eira Makabel, both in its Nekuda, because the Nekuda is concealed and is encompassed in its source, and then Lesla Megama Klum in its Binyan and its Ashpa, it's also not coming from Malchus. Remember, these 10 spheres in Malchus, these 9 spheres in Malchus are coming from Zah and from Atzilus, from high, and Keser, from higher levels, which we're going to learn about next. But before we continue, since there's a lot of details and somewhat dense, if anybody wants me to clarify anything, please feel free to ask any questions.
Yes, I've been thinking about this for a while. I don't understand.
One second. We need a referee. One at a time.
I'm waiting.
He's older than me. It's smarter than
Okay,
me.
Shlomo, you go first.
Is Helem or Atzmi and Atzmus one thing, or Helem or Atzmi is already something that is
How did I know that you're going to be talking to me about Helem Ha'atzmi? How did I guess that? Even though it's not even mentioned here on the page we learned yesterday.
It's a foundation of everything that is said just.
I think because I think your neshama is rooted in Helem Ha'atzmi. That's why I think that's what's going on.
It's Malchus Smith.
Anyway, Atzmus is higher than anything. So Atzmus doesn't have any names. The only thing you can say about Atzmus is built to Mitzias Nimtza, Mitzias Atzmuse, Mechuyev HaMitzias. So I don't know what, as I always tell you when you ask me these questions, I'm not sure what you mean by Atzmus. If you're talking about the element of Atzmus that's higher than Giluyim, that's Helem Atzmi. If you're talking about Atzmus that as he manifests in Giluyim, that's Oyer, that's Gili. So you have to define what you mean by Atzmus. You mean Atzmus that is built in Mitzias Nimtza before anything, so then we don't even use the word Helem Ha'atzmi. But Helem Ha'atzmi does convey to us an aspect that Atzmus is not defined by Oyer. It's a very big thing, because most people would say, Oyer is Me'ein HaMoyer, and how is God revealed to us? Through the light that he shines, through his creation. Chassidus teaches us, no, God is not defined by not to say that Oyer doesn't reflect on Elikus. Obviously, it reveals to us. Oyer actually reveals to us even Helam Atzmi, because the fact that we're aware of it and we can talk about it, that's also a Gili. However, Helam Atzmi is the aspect of the Kusei of Atzmus that is beyond Giluyim. But Atzmus is always, if you're talking about Atzmus, that's always beyond everything.
Al Pizeh,
You want to now say Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu is an Atzmus, and that drives everything, right? We spoke about that yesterday.
Yeah, so but
see, I know how you think.
Is it or it's not? What is the Nesava?
Well, let me ask you something. The Rebbe Rashab did not mention Nesava recently. I mean, he did speak about it pages back. So the fact is, he hasn't mentioned it. That doesn't mean it's not important. So what do you want to know whether everything starts with Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu or not? Is that what you're asking me?
It is, but the Nesava is a tale for the Atmos. We cannot understand Nesava, but is it a tale for the Atmos or not?
We say Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu Lislei Yisbarach Dira B'Tachtenim is Batzmusei Yisbarach. That's what we say. But as I pointed out as well, you have to say Atzmus is higher than Nesava too, because Atzmus is not defined by anything. But yes, the Nesava is in Atzmus. That's the language in Chassidus. Now, I have not seen in the Maimorim if they mean that, is that in Helam Atzmi, is it in Giluyim, is it higher than both? So that's why I avoid really answering it completely, simply by saying that we know that Afatayvin is talking Kasha, so it's definitely higher than any level of Seichel. It's Nesava Kosh Baruch Hu, Nesava B'Atzmusei. That's the Tamamiti, Al Pichsidis, why God created it all. There's no why as in a reason, but there's a cause, and the cause is the Nesava, the Taiva. So the Taiva is simply a word used. Now, you could ask, is Nesava connected to Tainug? Is it Atik? Ultimately, in the highest levels, this is something that has not really been discussed in Chassidus, and even the Chassidim that do talk about it have never come to any conclusions that I know of. There's no question that Nesava has some connection to Tainug, because Taiva and Tainug have something similar, but most likely Nesava is higher than any tziyur of Tainug. It's b'shem hamushal. We have no other name. We have no other word to use, so we say God desired. But I don't know if you can really call it a madrega or a darga. But that's the most I could say about it. That's the most I know about it. We can analyze it. The thing is, this is not the theme of Ayin Beis here. Right now, he's definitely talking on lower levels, and so I'm not sure what you want to get at.
You made it clear. Thank you, and thank you, Tzvi, for allowing me.
My pleasure.
Okay,
I
now
learned a lot.
you're next.
Okay, I have something. I might be looking at the whole thing wrong, but I kept hearing that the Melech is at the high levels. He was bittul. I don't understand in the word anything to relate to anything with the Eibishter or Melech or in the high. Well, low, obviously not. But in the high levels, how do you use the word bittul? I'm trying, racking my brains out. Maybe I'm just not understanding anything. I don't know.
I'm not sure what you're asking, to be honest. I don't get the question exactly.
Didn't you use?
I mean, we're talking about Malchus of
bittul.
Hold on. What's up? We're talking about Malchus of Atzilus. Are you aware of that? That's what the operative level that's being discussed in these pages is Malchus of Atzilus. Can you understand that Malchus in the Nekuda is the embodiment of Bittul?
Yes.
So that's what we're discussing here. What's the question on that? So Malchus is the embodiment of Bittul. That's why it's only a Nekuda. 1 second. That's why it's only a Nekuda. And he explained that Nekuda is rooted in places that are higher than any revelation. So that's why Malchus is called dark. You know, the different terms he used for it, it's dark because it's Helam, it's concealed. But that darkness is rooted in the place that's higher than any revelation. Is that clear?
Yep. But
okay.
I thought that high revelation was
now we need Now, because of that, Malchus can channel the power of creation into the lower worlds because it's a state of concealment. Like the sun, when the sun is shining brightly, it's too powerful to create. So it needs so-called the moon. But the moon also needs to shine. If Malchus is going to remain on a kuda and completely just a concentrated, concealed point, dark, it doesn't have the power to create a world and bring Malchus of God to existence, which includes two parts: the will to rule and the intelligence and the emotions to rule. So therefore, Malchus is built up now, again, not from itself. It's built up from Zohar and from the 10 spheres of Atzilus that channel through Malchus. So through this Nakuda and Bittul of Malchus is now being channeled faculties, if you wish, or attributes that create and govern creation. That's the theme here. So why who's applying Bittul?
I thought I made a mistake. I thought you were applying the word Bittul from the source of Malchus, and that I couldn't understand at all. I guess that's it. But it's not from any source. Okay, great.
Okay, good. What we were discussing is what is this nasus atzmis? How is that connected to the bittul of the nekuda of Malchus? That was part of this discussion that we started yesterday and having today. And what I would add to that, that's what I asked yesterday. But at the end of the day, it's nasus atzmis means, as I said, to put it in simple terms, someone that's not a they say a born king, not a king by through acquisition. It's not acquiring the quality, but someone that's born with the quality of kingship. So in the human terms, hisnasus atzmi means someone who just has a higher personality, just has a leadership quality, if you wish. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's an actual leader or he actually chose to become a leader, but he has that leadership quality. So Lamaila, hisnasus atzmis, is a level of just a certain exaltedness that God commands. He commands he has a certain dignity, if you wish to put it in those terms. Malchus captures that, but that's the Nakuda of Malchus. That's not Malchus as it actually becomes a king. That's more its personality, and that's rooted in Snasus Atzmis that goes up to very high levels. So the word bittul here, I explained that bittul allows for Snasus Atzmis because a person who's completely selfless is very much the personality of someone who really deserves to be a leader. A leader is not about someone who has a lot of power and ego and possessions and charisma. It's actually bittul, Chassidus explains, is what gives him that malchusdika quality, because he doesn't have an ego. I'm talking about in human terms. Lamaila, the godly dignity, so to speak, the godly malchus or remamus, is also, I wouldn't call it bittul, but it means it's not about control. It's not about domination, as many would think a king would be like. It's more about his very personality is just a higher state. It's a higher state of consciousness, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yep, now I understand, but once you use the word bittul, I get very confused. Thank you.
Okay, good. Any others? Questions? Any others? Now that we dealt with the sages in our group, let's now deal with the younger generation. Anyone from the younger? Okay. So with that said, I should also point out, and Yitzchak posted it on the group. So I did a little more digging into this. So on the previous page, we learned about that the Zmoichen of Zah, that's the idea, the prat is b'chinas hasaga mamish. And if you recall, he said that the difference between the two levels of yediyah, of awareness or perception, is igulim v'yesher. One is more makif, and one is more pnimi. Just a second. So he brought the parentheses, "V'ayim mashakasu b'mokem acher, di gulim hu al derech moshel di yurim alomim," that it's referring to the deaf residents. The example for water that the Medrash gives that sing God's praise, but they don't, but they're deaf. So they don't have any faculties like that at working. So Chassidus explains, and I founded the mimer from the Tzemach Tzedek on Yekovu Mayim in Eira Teir Bereshis, volume 7. The Rebbe Marash in Tofresh Chav Zayin, right in the beginning, literally, it's the same mimer word for word from the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Rebbe Rashab does quote it in several places. I think of B'voy Lefnei HaMelech Tofresh Nun Daled and Se'ener Rena Ayin Zayin, and a few other places there are from the Rebbe Rashab where he quotes and explains. But essentially, he's talking about that that there are two ways that one can sing God's praise. One is coming from what was called here, like the deaf residents. He calls that igulim, because they don't have actual faculties. And there's Yesher, which has faculties, and they sing God's praise. So look there in the Maimer, it talks about it at length. But that's, I just wanted to give some sources for that. Okay. So ready to go to the next paragraph? So now in the new paragraph, at the bottom of page 1361, Omnom. Gam la'achar shenivnes b'chinas hamalchus b'esas sfiras. Now that we discussed Malchus, how it gets built up. So also, however, even after Malchus gets built with the 10 spheres, not just an akudah of 1 point, but 10 spheres, in order for there to be the creation, and the energy and vitality, mibchinas Malchus, so this, even after Malchus is built up, it's not happening by Malchus alone. Who al yidei yichud zo Malchus. Maybe I should have sang the phrase a little differently. Omnam gam la'achar shenivnes b'chinas hamalchus b'esas sfiras. Even after Malchus is built up in esas sfiras, I read the Bichdei as a follow to that, but it doesn't change pshat. He says, in order for there to be creation and Malchus, you still need to have the yichud, the unification, and the joining of Zon Malchus. So now he's going to be explaining how Malchus doesn't have it on its own. It's not like you built up Malchus and now it's a self-contained entity. Even after Malchus is built up, it's still dependent on being connected with and united with Zah. Now, why is this so vital? So let me explain. Because remember, the ultimate point is that we want to have existence, but we also want this existence to have a relationship with God, with the divine. That's the interface. So Malchus is going to be the perfect interface in this sense. Why? Because on one hand, it's a concealment and diminishes the flow from the sun or Zah. So it has the power to create. Zah itself, he said, was too intense to create. Malchus therefore diminishes. On the other hand, Malchus is a melech. Malchus is not just something that's an equal to Biyah. It still retains its authority. But at the same time, it also has the Meichen and the Midas, so it also relates to the needs of Biyah. But Malchus still, you want to introduce Bittul into existence. So if Malchus becomes now a king that's just self-contained and not dependent on Zoh and the higher levels, then you can lose connection with the divine connection. In other words, it's a constant dance between being a separate consciousness, but also relate to the divine consciousness. So now he's going to explain how Malchus and Zoh interact with each other as a mashpia mekabel, even as Malchus creates biyah. That's the key emphasis right now. So he says like this: the zeh inyan iu v'garmu echad. So now he's quoting actually from Ageres HaKedah Siman Chaf 20, which is based on Zohar. The iu v'garmu. The Zohar says that in Atzilus iu v'chayu echad, iu v'garmu echad. You, God, is one with the chayui, which is either oir, and garmui, the kalim. There's also different interpretations, but for all practical purposes, he's saying like this: Iyu v'garmui echad, livre behen v'al yodon ma'ayin leyesh. So Malchus does not get disconnected from the energy, from the Iyu, that is giving it the power to create. And it's explained elsewhere, the Gamui b'chinas Malchus. The Gamui is the level of Malchus. So we see Iyu v'Gamui echad, you, God, are one. Iyu here really means Zoh, and the higher levels of Atzilus are one with Malchus. The Ima Yesha Koyach HaYesavos Malchus, and even though the actual power of creation is in Malchus, like we learned about the Eretz, the earth has the power to produce vegetation and growth. B'kol mokim hamahavahu b'chinas iyu. The creator is not Malchus. Malchus is just the place where the creative process manifests. But the creator of iyu. Like he writes in the Ageres HaKedah epistle, sections 20, the Esavus huma oir, that the Esavus comes, the power to create comes from the oir, being that the oir carries the creative power of the moir, of the luminary, of the source. However, the actualization of that power of creation rak ashazo is through the kalim. So the truth is, who gives the earth the power to, let's say, make things grow? Or a woman, a mother, to carry a child? It's God that gives her the power. But the power is in the womb, is in Malchus, is in Eretz. So it's coming from the Ur, which is carrying the power from the Moir, but it's manifesting and traveling through Malchus. Ayin Beis, like he's Ayin Beis, like he says in Tanya, Shar Yuchid V'Amuna, chapter 4, Be'in Hagadol Hagibur. So he speaks about Hagadol. God is called the Great One. That's Chesed. Hagibur, the strong one, the powerful one. That's Gvura. That's Tzimtzum. He says that you need both to create. You need the power of Gadol, Chesed, because that's the flow of creation, the creative flow. And you need Gvura, the Tzimtzum, in order to channel it. Ubeseifa Perek, at the end of chapter 4, he says, Shuzehu b'chinas Eres v'kelim. He says, Gadol v'gibur is Eres and Kelim. Ubepratius, when you break it down, hu b'chinas Zoh u'malchus. So Zoh represents more the divine energy, the mashpia, like the sun, and Malchus represents more the Kelim, the Makabel, that but it has the power through which of creation that manifests there. So this is all coming to emphasize that even when Malchus is built up, it still needs this constant connection to Zoh, or the Kelim need to constantly get their energy from the Ur. V'av gam im yisavus b'chinas Malchus b'keyach atzma. And even though we learned and we know that the power of Haisavus is Malchus with its own power, In other words, it's not the power of the oir that's just traveling through Malchus. Malchus itself became a creative power now. Like we see in the earth, there's a koyach etzemeach. It's not like a spiritual koyach etzemeach that just happens to travel through the earth. The earth itself has within manifest a power to a vegetation. God created that the earth has such a power. L'kol mokim, nevertheless, zeu dafka de hamshachas hamad de b'china zeh. Nevertheless, this, he doesn't say the word activates. We'll see how he explains it, but this takes place through the transmission of mad mayin tchurim, which is the ashpa of the mashpia, the b'china zeh, where, so even though Malchus does have it within itself, and we're going to learn, I'm going to stop here, but we're going to learn like the moon, that even though the moon doesn't have any light of its own, but it says it has light. It just can't shine on its own. So the same thing here is going to explain that it is in Malchus, but it can't express itself without the being triggered by the Amshachas Mad of Zah. This takes us back to what we learned earlier, how the Makabel, even the moon, the Eira Makabel needs the Eira Mashpia. You know what? I will read a few more lines. Like we see with the light of the moon, Sheyesh Beis Deis, there are two opinions. Imu Eira Shemesh, is it the light of the sun? Shemishtana Le'edei Levana. So it's actually the sunlight. It's just like it's being channeled through the moon, and therefore it changes through the moon. That's why it looks like the moonlight. That's one opinion. There, for sure, it's coming from the Shemesh, and the Levana is just a conduit. The second opinion is Shehu Eid Asma Shalal Levana. It's actually the light of the moon. B'kol Mokem Gam L'Dei Azu. Even according to that second opinion, nevertheless, even according to this second opinion, that is the moon itself. Next page, 1362. So even though the moon may have it in a certain dormant way, light, but it's only when the moon receives from the sun that it shines. So either way, the moon is dependent on the sun. The difference is the moon just a conduit, just passing through, so to speak, like Maiver? Or does the moon actually have light, but it does not get activated or triggered or switched on, so to speak, until the sun shines in it? Ubetulda, I'll do the parentheses and then I'll stop. Ubetulda, the same thing is when birthing. So how do yesh mikayach ha'av or mikayach ha'em? So what gives birth to something, to a child? So we know you need both the power of the father and the father of the mother. Ukadisa be Gemara, like the Gemara in Nida says, Levin minay av, that the things like the nails, the whiteness comes from the father. Shememena atzamis, the bones, v'edim, and the blood and everything that is red comes from mina'im, from the mother. Shememena gidim, from there come the veins or the arteries. Va'av zeich leben b'chachma u'benoi. And the Mishnah in Adia says that a father merits to have a son that's similar to him in wisdom and beauty. Bottom line is that a child is a product of both father and mother. What's he adding here? Same idea. It's not just the father and he is the driving force, and the mother is just a carrier of the fetus, but the mother also contributes, and the birthing is coming through her. It's true, without the father's seed, there will be no conception, like we learned earlier. But ultimately, it's Malchus, or in this case, that's actually the birthing is happening through the mother. Like he spoke earlier about the sun, about the earth and rain. You need rain to water the earth, but the birthing and the vegetation is grown through the earth. Bottom line is, he's saying what he's saying here, that even when Malchus has its own power, that power needs another force to get it to go. We learned earlier, Eira Mashpi is not like that. The sun does not need another force. Yes, it needs God to create the sun, but once the sun was created, it has all the nuclear fuels and the nuclear what do they call it? The nuclear energy, that the sun is able to be mashpia on its own. The moon, for it to give off light, according to either opinion, according to the first opinion, for sure needs the sun. Even the opinion that the moon has its own light, it's also cannot shine until the sun in some way activates, some ways entering into the moon. So what do we know from this? That Malchus, even as it's going into Biyah, with all its 10 spheres, the king, even as he's governing his nation, he's not alone. He's connected all the time to the source of that's giving him all that energy to be able to govern, to be able to create, and to be able to sustain existence. We're going to learn more about this, but I'm going to stop here because now he's going to go to explain what means the moon has nothing of its own. Malchus has nothing of its own. This explanation that is coming from Zah. What you see here is that even as Malchus has now become a full entity, it is always still connecting Biyah to Atzilus. That's the key thing to remember. So Zah is always an active player, even though Zah is now so-called behind the scenes, because it's all happening through Malchus, but Malchus is always connected to Zah, Yichud, Zah, Malchus. Any questions? I'm going to stop here after the parentheses on page 1362.
How do they explain that the specific traits, the blood vessels from here and this and that? How do they conform that? It must be right, but how does it relate to science and what we do know biologically?
Not sure if anybody's ever written about it. I need to research it. Some say it's attributed more to ancient Greek medicine, biology, and today you don't see it that way. But remember, even the concept they speaks about in Tanya, that the Etzem Moyach Ha'av, the tipa, the seed comes from Etzem Moyach Ha'av, has already been explained, that we're talking about the genetic matter, not necessarily the physical seed. In addition to the fact that you need the concentration of the father's mind to produce the seed. So I have not seen, but I'm sure there's some who've written about this topic. The Gemara Nida essentially says that the so-called things that are, because the seed clearly is white, the semen, the sperm. So they say that everything that's more like the bones, the teeth, comes from the seed, and things that are more like the blood vessels and so on come from the blood of the mother. So the question is how that's consistent with science. Somebody wants to do some research, please do. I don't recall right now.
And also the Chochmah or Benoit.
I mean, metaphorically, you can understand it. That there is, at the end of the day, modern science as well. You have to explain when a child is conceived, it has elements from the. I'm not just talking about the genes, but it also has different parts of the person that come from. You see, the features of a human being are similar to father and mother. Sometimes more father, sometimes more mother. So there is something being transferred over. That's not just the genetic matter; it's also even physical features. So I need to look into it more.
That's based on genetics. I mean,
I understand that. Anybody else want to ask anything or say anything? Okay, so we'll stop here. Top of page 1362, the end of the parentheses online.